After your first day of living with Aizawa, he had received a text from Detective Tsukauchi, reading, "Eraser, call when you have a moment. It's about Eiko." Aizawa had gone to the rooftop to take the call once you were asleep. "Tsukauchi, what did you find in the interrogation of Eiko's uncle?" Tsukauchi's voice spoke through the phone. "A lot of things aren't adding up. For one thing, the man who claimed to be Eiko's uncle appears to have a forged identity. His real name is Taro Teshima, no apparent relation to Eiko at all. But he wasn't the one who forged a new identity. Someone was behind it all, paying him to raise Eiko." Aizawa glowered at the nighttime lights of the cityscape. "Explain." "Well, we still don't know very much, but I'll tell you everything the interrogation uncovered. The pretended uncle has always had alcoholic tendencies, so he had trouble keeping a job. When someone approached him with the offer of covering all his living expenses if he'd raise the child according to their directions, he agreed." "What directions?" "They asked him to be tough on her, to turn her into someone desperate, and they also requested that he persuade her to hate her quirk," Tsukauchi informed him, dislike in his usual businesslike tone. Aizawa's grip tightened on the phone, eyes narrowing. "Who is this person?" "We don't know. This abuser never knew his name or saw him except when he was covering himself with a hoodie and mask. We'll keep investigating. There's so many red flags about this situation, but we don't have all the information we need to put it all together." Aizawa silently agreed. The most dangerous enemy was one you had no information on. He didn't like that you were at the center of it all, and you didn't even know it. Tsukauchi continued. "Well, we have a DNA sample from Eiko and from this imposter uncle. We have a pretty good DNA information bank on criminals, and with DNA quirk analysis, we might be able to figure out who Eiko's biological parents are. It could provide leads on how she ended up in the situation you found her in, and who is responsible for doing this to her. I'll keep you updated." "Thanks, Tsukauchi," Aizawa approved. "No problem," the detective replied. "It'll take a couple weeks for the lab to process the DNA samples. Until then." He hung up a moment later. Over the next couple weeks, Aizawa focused his entire attention on helping you adjust to your new life. He would do so calmly and rationally. There was one problem. The more he noticed ways that your past impacted you, the more he developed a simmering anger against your past guardian. He knew that you could shift between your normal cat-eared form and your fully human form at will, but he'd started to notice that you hid your cat ears whenever you got nervous, or whenever you went out in public. When he asked you the reason for this, you'd flinched and instinctively made your cat ears vanish from your messy black hair as you looked down at the ground. Aizawa stared at you with concern as you admitted, "My uncle always warned me not to show my quirk." The flinch in your reaction told Aizawa all that he needed to know. So that was it. There had been a destructive pattern to what set off your uncle's dangerous temper. A focus on making you ashamed of your quirk, like Tsukauchi had said. Anger simmered in him, but he refocused. What mattered now was helping you. You started in surprise as Aizawa placed a hand on your head. The gesture was so unexpected that you looked up and met his gaze. "Kid, there's nothing wrong with your quirk. You don't have to hide it from anyone, ever. Your uncle was wrong to make you feel otherwise." His tone was calm and firm. Your amber eyes swirled with thoughts as you stared up at him. After all you'd been through, emotionally, to make you think otherwise, believing his words was difficult. But you trusted Aizawa more than any other person on earth. If he said it, it must be true. "Okay," you nodded. Your cat ears reappeared after a moment of hesitation. You were showing Aizawa that you intended to act on his advice. He saw and understood, giving you an encouraging nod before turning away. A few days later, he heard you yell during the night and had immediately burst into your room to see what was wrong. He found you sitting up in bed, shivering and wide-eyed. "Eiko, are you okay?" Aizawa questioned. Yes, you replied weakly. It was just a memory. I mean, a dream. Aizawa walked over to you and hugged you tightly. He wasn't the kind of person to give out hugs freely, but he could always tell what people needed, and it was plain as day that you needed a hug right then. Eiko, I promise you that you don't have to fear anyone from your past anymore. I'll make sure of that. He glared at the far wall as he thought about the people who had done this to you. Meanwhile, you felt safe, protected. Being held by your hero dad made all your fears vanish. You felt surrounded by strength and warmth, and the hand holding the back of your head was even like a headrest. Aizawa looked down in surprise. Your breathing had become audible as soft sighs every time you exhaled. Had you just fallen asleep? He stayed sitting on your bed, holding you. His insomnia and unending thoughts wouldn't allow him to sleep anyways. Might as well hold you for a while. He passed the time by thinking about your past, the progress of each of his students, about fighting techniques, about problems in the Hero Society. Aizawa's brain never really stopped analyzing. Eventually, he decided that you were deeply asleep enough that he could put you down without waking you up. You were completely limp in his arms, like a cat drunk on sunlight. He gently lowered you back onto your unzipped sleeping bag and zipped it around you snugly. You shifted slightly, murmuring something, but your expression remained peaceful. He brushed a strand of hair from your face. Then he stood, looking down at you. What a problem child. You woke up peacefully in the morning, snug in your sleeping bag. Then you shot up right in alarm at how bright it was outside. You'd started going to a new school, and at this rate, you were going to be late. You hurried to get dressed and go downstairs. Aizawa was in the kitchen, scrambling eggs in a frying pan with a lazy slowness to his motions. "Dad!" you exclaimed loudly. He looked tiredly over his shoulder at you as you continued. "I slept through my alarm, and I'm going to be late for school." Aizawa chuckled, making you stare in annoyance. He raised an eyebrow at your expression. You were already starting to become more assertive. Eiko, calm down. It's Saturday. You don't have to go to school. The eggs sizzled in the pan as Aizawa scrambled them and tossed in some chopped green onions and salt. Your panic slowly turned to relief. Saturday. You should have realized when you saw Aizawa looking so relaxed. His hair was pulled back into a casual bun, and he had slippers on. If it had been a school day, he would have been in his hero clothes and up at UA already. "Sorry," you apologized bashfully. You sat down at the table, watching the dust mote sparkle and swirl within the sunbeams that streamed in through the windows. Aizawa joined you across the table a moment later, dishing the scrambled eggs out of the pan to divide them equally onto the two plates. Aizawa's point of view. When you had first moved in, you'd gotten pretty bad stomach aches after your meals. Being starved so often in your past resulted in you not knowing how to stop eating when you felt full. Aizawa had realized, and now he always dished your plate himself until you could adjust to always being given enough food. You thought he was such a good cook. Mike and anyone else who knew Aizawa well would have cringed to hear that you thought so. He scowled as you obliviously chewed with your mouth full. He'd have to teach you table manners. It would be his responsibility if people avoided you for not knowing basic things like that. Adopting a child who hadn't been taught or cared for correctly was all kinds of complicated, he thought tiredly. Eiko, he instructed, keep your lips closed when you chew. You started an alarm, hurriedly shutting your mouth. A minute later, you forgot again. Aizawa observed you. Your lack of skills didn't directly bother him. He would continue to patiently teach you, whatever it took to get you on your feet in life. You finished your plate faster than Aizawa did. After that, you were content to watch Aizawa finish at a slower pace. It was quiet, except for the soft sounds of silverware clinking against the plate, and chewing. He didn't talk much. That was fine with you. You weren't really used to talking anyways, and loud people scared you. Showtime! You jumped out of your seat with superhuman strength, landing in a defensive crouch as Mike's voice set the table and kitchen utensils rattling. He kicked open the door enthusiastically, sunglasses gleaming above his wide grin as he strode into your house. Aizawa slowly turned his head in a dark glower. Mike, how many times do I have to remind you that your voice is a weapon? Aizawa's eyes widened as he noticed Mike's extra excited hand gestures and realized that Mike was in a rare mood where nothing could calm his overenthusiasm. His eyes flashed red as he canceled Mike's quirk just in time. Today is going to rock! Mike yelled, very fortunately deprived of his quirk. First guitar lesson with my favorite niece! It's jam time! The amount of barely contained energy in Mike's arm gestures was insane. Your fear had diminished as soon as you'd realized it was Mike. And then, his words sunk in. Your eyes sparked excitement. You'd been trying to figure out the guitars Mike had gifted you ever since moving in 2 weeks ago. Really? Now? You bounced in place. Aizawa glowered tiredly, still canceling Mike's quirk. There was way too much energy in the room, especially for this early in the morning. And there was about to be a lot more when the guitars came out. He sighed, stopping erasure and letting his eyes close before looking up more neutrally at the situation. You looked at Aizawa hopefully. He met your gaze, seeming to consider. That's fine, Mike, he decided. Actually, I have to go run an errand right now. Just be careful with your quirk. And Eiko. He strode over to a drawer and pulled out a package of earplugs. Wear these around Mike at all times. They have fairly strong general sound muffling properties, and when the sound exceeds 500 decibels, which Mike's quirk definitely would, it will compress and strengthen its silencing properties by a factor of 100. They should be compatible with your cat ears, according to their quirk compatibility ratings. You pulled them out and put them on, with a bit of twisting and poking them into place. Are you sure you don't want to join the lesson? You asked Aizawa curiously. He said something. You couldn't hear a word. What? You frowned. He said that he wants to get the errand done, but that you should have fun. Mike sounded perfectly audible. Oh, you replied, smiling at Aizawa hesitantly. Aizawa scowled. Mike's normal speaking voice was, as he'd predicted, loud enough to get through the earplugs. You would be able to hear him without trouble, unless he went above 500 decibels and activated the extra silencing. You watched as Aizawa spoke a few more words to Mike, then lifted his hand in a casual farewell gesture as he walked over to the door to put on boots. Are you ready? Mike asked you excitedly. Yes, you nodded. Acoustic or electric guitar today? Mike could barely contain all his energy. His gestures were overflowing with it. Bring down your electric with the amp. Let's get this party started. Aizawa hurriedly pulled on his boots and made a ninja exit upon hearing those words. Aizawa's point of view. Aizawa felt hesitant about leaving you, but he trusted Mike. Hisashi Yamada tended to get carried away, but there was a method to his madness. He was no airhead. And it worked out well, considering that he needed to meet Tsukauchi this morning to discuss the DNA test results. Tsukauchi met him at the front of the building when he pulled up, and walked with him into the office areas. Eraser, Tsukauchi started, hesitating slightly. After seeing the lab work from Eiko's DNA test, I have to ask, have you noticed anything unusual about Eiko's quirk? Aizawa paused at the question. Yes, he replied, I have. Well, Tsukauchi prompted, seeming to expect that response. Aizawa stared at the office room, mulling everything over as he told Tsukauchi, my erasure has no effect on her. Of course, he'd tried erasure when he'd first suspected that you were more than a cat. If you'd been a shapeshifter, erasure would have worked. That is, it should have worked, but it hadn't. And he'd wondered why ever since. Tsukauchi sighed. That's what we thought. Her DNA indicates a permanent form, like a heteromorphic type cat-quirk. If not for your account of things, I would assume that she cannot shapeshift away from her cat-eared form. But you've seen her vary from that form by shifting to 100% human and to 100% cat? She can switch between all 3 forms, Aizawa confirmed. It shouldn't be possible, but Eiko proves otherwise, Tsukauchi mused. I'll let you know if we can figure out more about it. Thanks, Tsukauchi, Aizawa replied as the detective promised to keep him updated. Everything they discovered seemed to only raise more questions. Aizawa's eyes narrowed as he thought about it. The meeting with Tsukauchi had been brief, so he might as well run a few other errands while Mike taught you guitar. He needed to stop by his office at UA to pick up some forms, and it wouldn't hurt to swing by the store. He had always used a lot of squeezable food pouches to work around the clock, but now that you were with him, he was putting more effort into preparing real food. He paused, struck with a sudden thought. Could it be that taking care of you was forcing him to take care of himself? Because of you, he was cooking and somewhat sticking to a sleep schedule. Mike and Midnight were going to tease him mercilessly if they noticed. They'd been trying to get him to do those things for eons. His friends were so persistent. Why they kept bothering him, even after distancing himself, he had no idea. There was no getting rid of them. And by introducing you to them, you'd be stuck with them as well. Mike had immediately treated you like family, and Aizawa knew that Midnight would undoubtedly spoil you just like Mike did. Aizawa got along with Midnight better than he did with most people, but he was reluctant to introduce you to her. Midnight's unusual enthusiasm for youth might be overwhelming, and he didn't think that the R-rated hero would be the ideal role model for a young person. Aizawa considered. He didn't have that many friends to begin with. Who would make a good role model for you? Joke? He suddenly pictured Joke in his living room, teasing him and proposing to him while you watched in astonishment. No way. He shuddered. Your point of view. Mike helped you tune the guitar, then began with the basics. So, first things first. He positioned your hands and elbows for you, showing you with tips on how to get the best mobility for playing the instruments. You're ready to jam, he declared. Let's get rockin' with the C chord. Your eyes widened as the strum created a rich blend of notes from the way Mike had shown you how to position your fingers. Your fingers trembled with the effort, but all your experimenting had made them calloused, so that the strings didn't hurt. You're a natural, Mike yelled. So far, he'd kept his quirk under control, and the extra silencing hadn't been necessary. You wondered briefly if Mike was more careless around Aizawa out of habit, since Aizawa always erased his overpowered yells. Now let's move on to an A minor chord, Mike enthused. You threw yourself into the lesson eagerly. Mike had taught you so much. You repeated the background chords he'd shown you, and Mike played a complicated solo melody that fit with it perfectly. It was incredible. You realized that you really were learning from a pro. Eventually, Mike set down the guitar, noticing that your hands were starting to tremble from the tiredness. You rock, kid, Mike grinned. You're going to sound pro in no time. Let's break. Want a snack? You nodded. You never said no to food. Mike went to raid Aizawa's pantry, leaving you to wait around in the living room. It was funny hearing Mike bang around and generally make a racket in the kitchen. The door to the yard was open, and Mike sounded like he might take a while. You wandered outside, enjoying the sunshine, and climbed up on the wall to sit where you and Aizawa normally watched the sunset. Everything looked totally different, with the sun climbing high. It would be directly overhead in an hour or so, and the landscape looked bleached of color and filled with blindingly warm sunshine. You noticed 3 boys walking down the alleyway, some distance away. You stared curiously. They were varied heights, but all around your age. The tallest had brown hair in a neat buzz cut. The second tallest had messily grown-out blonde hair, with a skateboarder vibe in the way he dressed. It was the shortest that immediately captured your attention. His undeniably purple shock of hair fluffed up as though he'd been electrocuted. The boys were all walking away, so you couldn't see any of their faces until the purple-haired boy turned to face the other 2. revealing that his irises and eyebrows matched his purple hair color. You pulled out your earplugs to hear their conversation. None of them had noticed you yet. Hello, it's Anya K. I know, cliffhangers are the worst, but I hope you'll forgive me. I already wrote the next part of the story, which continues from this one, and I just need to record it, so yay, you won't have to wait super long. This was the best spot that I could find to stop. If I'd read more of what I wrote, it would have been an even worse cliffhanger. Not a lot happened in this part, but the next part was super fun to write. Be sure to click the bell so that you know when it's uploaded. Also, please enjoy the sweet artwork that people sent to go with the fanfic series. I'm gonna pull it up on the screen right now. And lastly, a lot of people are wondering when Eiko will meet Class 1A, and what they will think of her. Well, now you know. Eiko is the same age as all of them, and yes, she will meet all of them, but first we need to know the story of some things in her younger years. Mysterious author vibes. I'm glad that you listened to part 3 of this Irrational series. Links in description, first 2 parts of the story, Discord, Wattpad, Instagram. Have the best day, and take care of yourself, you irrational problem child.